Okay, great. We're on recording and here at 12:02, we can get started even as people are still joining. It's wonderful to see everybody. Thank you for taking the time to learn about this incredibly important issue. We're usually on our online teach-ins focusing on particular clean energy solutions. And today we're going to be looking at this process that's been going on related to the Climate Act, the CLCPA, which is to basically develop criteria to identify disadvantaged communities, which we usually, say for short DACs, to make sure that our transition to clean energy, the massive reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that we're going to be doing between now and 2050, to ensure that frontline communities, underserved communities really benefit from this historic transition, and that no community is left behind in the clean energy transition, and has not only reduced pollution, cleaner air, economic opportunities, and a chance to live in a healthy, comfortable, decarbonized home. So we know how important it is that the transition is just and equitable. And so we're going to be learning today about this criteria developed by the Climate Justice Working Group, which we're very grateful to have a member, Sonal Jessel, here today to talk about that. And listen to kind of the details of the draft criteria, and then how we can comment on this criteria, which is due, the comments are due July 7th. So very soon, and there's a couple of hearings between now and then. So it's very timely and really wonderful that you all are here today to learn about this and hopefully participate, so we can really strengthen our state's commitment to a just and equitable transition to clean energy and off fossil fuels. So I will pass it over to Jen, who's going to be talking, kind of about the high level importance of all of this. Jen actually helped get this law passed, the CLCPA, so she's a very appropriate person to open it up. Jen Metzger, who is NYCP's policy director and former state senator. And I should also mention that sadly, my partner in crime, Ibrahim Abdul Mateen, who is supposed to be hosting this today, ended up losing his voice, which is a very important thing if you're hosting an event. So he's resting his voice, and hopefully will be able to join us for the next one next month. So feel better, Ibrahim, and thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. And as always, we want to hear from you. Put your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them and get our speakers' thoughts at the end of their presentations. So, and thanks again, everybody. And I will pass it off to Jen.
Thanks so much, Betta. And thanks everyone for joining us today. So New York's law is as much about equity and environmental justice as it is about tackling the climate crisis. And they are all inextricably linked. The climate law acknowledges and seeks to redress the historical, racial, and economic injustices that are pervasive throughout our energy economy. It acknowledges, for instance, that, when you flick on the switch to turn your lights on, that electricity in good part is being generated from dirty fossil fuel power plants that are typically sited in low-income and Black and brown communities at great cost to their health and well-being. And it's not just the power sector, it's the transportation sector. It's where bus depots and, highway infrastructure is typically sited in or adjacent to. So that legacy of discrimination is woven into the fabric of the fossil fuel economy. And what I find incredibly exciting about the shift to a clean energy economy is the opportunity we have to build a healthier economy in society. A highly unequal economy in society is not a healthy economy in society in any sense of the word. So we have this incredible opportunity before us to create an equitable, sustainable, and healthier New York if we put the right policies and programs in place to achieve the goals of New York's climate law. I'm going to share my screen and we'll do a little refresher on what those goals are. Let's see. Here we go. It's not advancing. There we go. Sorry. Okay. So very broadly, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which we passed in 2019, commits New York to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 below 1990 levels and 85% by 2050 with the goal of achieving net zero emissions. It also requires that we generate 70% of our electricity from renewable resources by 2030 and 100% of our electricity from carbon-free sources by 2040. And critically, we are to achieve these goals, both justly and equitably. The law requires that disadvantaged communities be prioritized in emissions reductions. So, and this is not just greenhouse gas emissions, but also other associated hazardous air pollutants. Any emissions reduction strategies also must not adversely impact disadvantaged communities, for instance, by introducing other harmful pollutants or by increasing the energy cost burden. The state is required under the law to dedicate 35% of the benefits of clean energy investments to disadvantaged communities with the goal of 40%. Really, I mean, it has to be at least minimally 40%, as we'll talk about later in this program. And as we transition to a clean energy economy, disadvantaged communities are to be a priority focus in workforce development and training. A job study was done by the Just Transition Working Group, which I'll mention in a second, that found that, if we stay on track to meet our climate goals, we're going to see a net gain of nearly 180,000 jobs by 2030 and nearly 270,000 jobs by 2050. That's unprecedented, and it offers an enormous opportunity to reduce an inequality in our state and really lift communities that have been left behind. But it's not going to happen unless disadvantaged community members get the support that they need to be able to take advantage of these clean energy opportunities. The climate law also directs what includes a number of specific directives to the Public Service Commission and NYSERDA on clean energy investments in disadvantaged communities. These include initiating and implementing easily replicable renewable energy projects in public low-income housing throughout the state, suburban, urban, and rural areas. It includes designing renewable energy and energy efficiency programs so that they provide substantial benefits to disadvantaged communities at reasonable cost. That cost factor is extremely important. It also, the law also requires that the commission specify, to the extent practicable, a minimum percentage of storage projects to disadvantaged communities to reduce their reliance on dirty peaker plants, which is responsible for a lot of very harmful pollution in those communities. And finally, it requires that utilities and NYSERDA track and publish data on energy savings and clean energy investments in low and moderate income households and disadvantaged communities, so that we can really make sure that we are staying on track and meeting our equity goals. The climate law also requires the Department of Environmental Conservation to develop a community air monitoring program for disadvantaged communities with potentially high pollution exposure burdens, and as well as a strategy for reducing those pollutants. So I've been using the term disadvantaged communities a lot already. So, to whom does that refer exactly? The climate law defines disadvantaged communities as communities that bear burdens of negative public health effects, environmental pollution, impacts of climate change, and possess certain socioeconomic criteria or comprise high concentrations of low and moderate income households. And there's more specific criteria within the law. And of course, the Climate Justice Working Group has been fleshing that criteria out. We'll hear a lot more about that today. So, the climate law sets out these ambitious equity goals and requirements, but how do we really make sure that we're meeting them and that they are truly meeting the needs, that we are truly meeting the needs of disadvantaged communities? Building equity and inclusion into the planning and decision-making process on the law's implementation is one of the important ways to do this. The climate law established a climate justice working group that includes representatives from environmental justice communities statewide, as well as representatives from DEC, the Department of Health, the Labor Department, and NYSERDA. This working group is responsible for developing the criteria for disadvantaged communities that we're going to talk about today, but it's also required to provide input into the Climate Action Council's scoping plan. That draft plan is still open for public comment, as well as the DEC's regulations that will implement that plan. Another important working group created that I had mentioned earlier, created by the law, is the Just Transition Working Group, which includes representatives from environmental justice communities and from labor, and is responsible for advising on workforce development and training opportunities and developing recommendations to ensure that we have a just transition to a clean energy economy. And then lastly, the law creates a permanent environmental justice advisory group and interagency environmental coordinating council to ensure that environmental justice is considered in all relevant state agency and department decisions. The advisory group is to develop a model environmental justice policy and monitor government-wide compliance on an ongoing basis. So the law really sought to build environmental justice and representation into the process of developing the regulations that we need to reach our goals. So I tried to create a visual to make it easier to grasp this kind of complex decision-making process created under the climate law. The top timeline is the process for developing the Climate Action Council scoping plan, and then that will be followed by the DEC promulgating regulations to meet the Climate Act's targets and goals. And the bottom timeline is the process of the Climate Justice Working Group to develop the criteria and a map of disadvantaged communities. I just wanted to make it clear that these are parallel processes with their own public comment periods. And both public comment periods are currently open for a little more time. The scoping plan comment period closes July 1st. And the comment period, as Betta mentioned, for the draft DAC criteria closes on July 7th. And we encourage you to submit comments for both. There are, for the weighing in on the disadvantaged communities criteria, there are 2 virtual public hearings left. They've held a number of public hearings. I have to say I attended one in Poughkeepsie, and it was really, there was hardly anyone there. I think there wasn't enough, in my opinion, outreach done to get them there, but it's really important that people provide input and support really to the goals of the law and of this process. So there is a virtual hearing that you can register for the Hudson, if you're from the Hudson Valley region. If you're from Western New York, there's also a virtual hearing. The Hudson Valley is June 29th. Western New York is June 30th. And you can also, from anywhere in the state, submit written comments by July 7th. And we'll share these slides with you, so you can just click on the links to register if you like, or get the information about how to submit comments. And I'm going to stop there because we have great guests to hear, really informative guests to hear from. I'll turn it back over to you, Betta, and look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Jen. That was fantastic. And next up, we will be hearing from Samir Ranade, who is the Climate Justice Advisor to the Climate Action Council. And Samir will be going into how the Climate Justice Working Group developed this draft criteria and how it will be used going forward. So thanks so much for being here, Samir.
Great. Thank you so much, Betta. Let me find my screen here. Give me 1 second. Can everybody see my screen?
No.
Okay, actually here.
We did do a test run, so it should be working, and it is. There you go.
All right, 1 second here. Okay, and you can still see the slide deck?
Yes, we can see you more than we can see the slide deck, but I think we can see what's on the screen, so it works.
Great. Well, so I'll give a quick high-level overview of the criteria, and then I'll briefly explain its purpose. And first, I just want to thank you, all of you, for being involved and submitting public comments, because this informs the policy and it strengthens our democratic process. I also want to highly recommend that you browse the disadvantaged community criteria section of the Climate Act website. And you could also watch, there's an hour-long public education session that goes in depth into the criteria. So if you have deeper technical questions, they're very likely to be answered by the video or materials on the website. And just echoing what was said, the Climate Act is truly a transformative law because it prioritizes disadvantaged communities. These ambitious pollution reduction and clean energy requirements will be met with holistic action, delivering benefits that allow every New York community across urban, suburban, and rural parts of our state to be safe, healthy, and thriving. That is the only way we can solve climate change and achieve justice. So the main charge of the Climate Justice Working Group was to identify the criteria for what constitutes a disadvantaged community. Along with their lived experience, this language helped guide the working group in considering the indicators that could identify disadvantaged communities. This explained, these factors correlate to climate injustices that exist due to historical and ongoing discriminatory practices. There is the legacy of redlining. It's a now outlawed practice where the federal government excluded Black homebuyers from accessing loan programs that would make it affordable to purchase a home in neighborhoods with higher property values and a healthier environment. And to show how the effects of this practice continue to affect communities today, if you were to take a map of our state showing major air pollution sources or the census tracts with the least tree cover and lay that over another map of our state showing communities that were previously redlined, you would see a complete or near complete match in most cases. So the indicators of a disadvantaged community that were drafted by the Climate Justice Working Group, they had to draw from three components that you see on your screen. Environmental burdens, then there's demographics and health vulnerabilities, and climate change risks. So the working group reviewed over 170 different indicators from those three components, and ultimately narrowed it down to 45. So keep in mind that having more or less indicators doesn't necessarily determine the quality of the criteria. There's a lot of things to consider, like the degree of overlap between indicators, whereby a certain amount is useful, but too much can make the indicators duplicative. The 45 indicators proposed were based on sufficient granular statewide data that was available on a census tract level. 20 indicators relate to environmental burdens and climate risks, which are grouped together, and then 25 indicators are related to population characteristics and health vulnerabilities. These are the three factors within the environmental burden and climate change risk component score, and you can see the indicators that come from them. Potential pollution exposures, that includes pollution indicators like traffic density and wastewater discharge, land use and facilities associated with historical discrimination or disinvestment. That includes data like remediation sites, active landfills, vacancy rate, and then there's potential climate risks. This includes data on extreme heat and flooding. There are 4 factors within the population characteristics and health vulnerabilities component score, and you can see the indicators that come from them. Income, education, and employment. This includes information on low and moderate incomes, single parent households, and the unemployment rate. There's race, ethnicity, and language. This includes race and ethnicity data, as well as limited English proficiency. Health impacts and sensitivities, including things like low birth weight babies and asthma emergency visits. And there's housing, energy, and communications. This includes the number of renter-occupied homes, energy poverty, and housing cost burden. This slide shows a visual breakdown of the scoring approach. There's multiple steps that were taken to arrive at a final score for a disadvantaged community. All of the indicators, all 45 of the indicators were ranked on a percentile basis from 0 to 100 to determine a census tract score relative to another census tract. So it's all on a comparative basis. The indicators within each factor were multiplied to produce a combined score for the factor. Then the factor scores within the components were multiplied to provide a component score. Lastly, the two components are multiplied by one another to attain a single score for each census tract across New York State. I want to note that the climate risk factor was double weighted in order for it to have equal importance to environmental burdens. Within the race and ethnicity factor, Black and Latino households were double weighted, and the income and education factor, poverty was double weighted. To ensure an equitable distribution of disadvantaged communities across the state, the working group proposed to use a combined scoring approach. So census tracts would be designated as a geographic disadvantaged community if they scored in the top 27 percentile on a statewide basis, within New York City, or in the rest of the state. So this draft proposal made it so that 35% of New York census tracts were designated as geographic disadvantaged communities. And finally, all census tracts where at least 5% of the land is a federally recognized reservation or owned by an Indian nation were included. In addition, every household in the state with an income at or below 60% of statewide median income was included in the criteria, no matter where it was located. So this would apply to state energy spending on household programs. And the working group, this is a really important point, which I'll come back to. The working group must review the criteria on an annual basis. So I want to share lastly how our state will use the criteria. At least 35% with the goal of 40% of the state's clean energy spending must benefit disadvantaged communities. This goal will apply to place-based programmatic investments like energy efficiency retrofits. It won't count spending on large-scale energy projects that are statewide in scope because they serve the entire state. However, the quantifiable benefits they produce will still be tracked and accounted for. The criteria, as Jen mentioned, will also be used in the development of air pollution regulations and regulatory impact statements to bar new environmental burdens from being created in the community. There's also a really important requirement per the Barriers and Opportunities Report, which I'll drop into the chat, that requirement is that the state must focus on increasing access and ownership to both clean energy and climate hazard protections in disadvantaged communities. This is crucial to realize the principle of procedural justice, and it means that it's not just clean energy programs that must it means that we won't just provide funding for these programs, but we will make sure that the programs that get the funding are designed and administered in a way that meets community needs so that the benefits actually can be realized. There are numerous climate, health, and economic benefits that are going to be realized from climate action, from implementing the CLCPA. We're tracking and accounting for them, and by prioritizing their realization in disadvantaged communities, we will directly or indirectly reduce the inequity that is represented by the 45 indicators that I previously showed. The Climate Justice Working Group will revisit the criteria at least once a year to monitor our progress and recommend changes. Over time, the Climate Act will correct those disadvantages so they don't exist. And that really is the goal of climate justice. I also just want to acknowledge that I shared a lot of heavy information that's probably pretty dense, but again, please check out the website, and certainly during the Q&A, we can try to answer them. So thank you so much, Betta. I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Samir. That is a lot to take in, but appreciate you walking us through it. And I will now pass it over to Sonal Jessel, who is the Director of Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice and was a Climate Justice Working Group member. So thank you so much, Sonal, for being here to talk about the importance and application of this criteria and how it hopefully will improve the climate and health outcomes in the disadvantaged communities that receive funding. So thank you.
Thanks, Betta. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm just going to go over for a couple quick minutes, and then I know we have lots of questions in the chat. Hopefully you all are seeing just my full screen slide, not two screens, right?
Yep.
I see that there's two pictures that I see, but
okay, let me swap. I can never tell which one people are seeing. Yeah, so I'll just go over a couple minutes.
Perfect.
What this means for We Act as an organization and organizations like ours that are on the ground, and what this funding can mean for communities, just to kind of circle out the conversation. If you don't know us, I'm the Director of Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice. We are a community-based organization in West Harlem in New York City. And we started in 1988 out of active organizing against a sewage treatment plant being placed on the west side of Harlem. It was considered an act of environmental racism, as Harlem is a place that was in a bigger way and still is now a very much considered disadvantaged community. It was a majority Black and African-American population, had some of the highest asthma rates in the state, and was home to 9 out of the 10 bus depots in Manhattan, and home to a lot more industrial sites as well. So it was a place that was considered to be essentially already burdened with environmental issues. And so then placing this facility was yet just another added burden. And so We Act started out of the fight against this plant. And since we've been organizing communities in Harlem, Washington Heights, and Inwood, and doing policy on environmental justice. So one big planning document we worked on in 2015 happened after Hurricane Sandy in 2012, where members of Northern Manhattan essentially felt unprepared for climate change and felt like the neighborhoods that they were living in weren't receiving investments, mitigation strategies, and their homes were not well equipped for dealing with climate change. And so we took members, it was around 500 people in Northern Manhattan, through a process where they essentially were coming up with the solutions for climate mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency work. And that is what we now call the Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan, and you can find it on our website. And you obviously can't see the writing here, it's very small here, but this is the picture of the plan, and what it has is all sorts of different elements of what the community members that we worked with wanted to see when addressing climate change in Northern Manhattan. And ultimately, this plan really informs the work that we do when it comes to our climate policies. So being on the climate justice working group for me meant that I was thinking about how this 35 to 40% minimums benefits of climate investments in the state were going to communities like ours and could help realize these kinds of plans that have been made. So it's something that has been guiding our work ever since. And so Samir and Jen went over this a bit, that what the disadvantaged communities criteria is. And I took this from our slides from the state work, which is ultimately the purpose is we are looking for greenhouse gas emissions reductions. Number one, that's the big goal for the Climate Act, but what's also huge goals are co-pollutant reductions, which are those, PM 2.5, NOx and VOx and sulfur dioxide and all sorts of different air pollutants that are predominantly burdening communities like Harlem, communities that are lower income, communities of color across New York State that have been dealing with this kind of disproportionate air pollution burden, which our concern with that is that it leads to health impacts. So it leads to cardiovascular and respiratory illness. And so we see a higher rates of asthma hospitalization, for example, and premature mortality. And we are very invested in this process because we believe that the disadvantaged communities criteria in this state really focusing on directing investments towards communities that have been historically burdened for decades is going to ultimately address that. Are we able to mute everyone?
Yeah, I think I just muted everyone. Thank you.
It's ultimately able to give us the funding and the investments and the benefits ultimately that we need to address this legacy environmental justice issue. So I'll just go over some examples of where we envision this helping, just to kind of set it in a little bit of perspective. So the Bronx Waterfront, it's an area that is adjacent to where We Act directly organizes. We recently was a part of a wonderful boat ride with Congressmember Espaillat, looking at the Bronx and Northern Manhattan waterfront and how little waterfront access there is in these areas. And a lot of that is due to the fact that, especially on the Bronx side, there has been so much industrial development, so many siting of facilities that has cut off waterfront access for communities there. So one thing that we see there, especially as the Bronx and the South Bronx are one of the most polluted areas of New York City. They deal with some of the highest health burdens. They deal with some of the lowest income community members. They are absolutely a disadvantaged community. And what this means is there can be investments flowing from the state government directed towards this community for things like, let's build up the waterfront so we're ready against flooding, for example. We're able to mitigate extreme heat if we have more vegetation. And an indirect, we believe an indirect result of climate investment work in these areas can be closing dirty peaker plants, which are power plants that are especially polluting to local communities. So if we're building up renewable energy sources, if we're building up solar, we're building up wind, we're finding other ways to power our communities, then we're able to close the most polluting facilities. a principle that We Act really works by, and this is as a result of our Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan that we did in 2015, is the idea of energy democracy, which I took a little mini example definition from the Energy Democracy Project, which is the idea that energy is a shared economic resource. It is a driver of development. It doesn't destroy our ecosystem, but it even could potentially regenerate in different ways. And it is a source of empowerment and a source of reparative justice for people who have been disproportionately burdened by a racist system. And so we promote energy democracy in a lot of ways. And so we see this DAC criteria and investment in the communities that we represent, like Harlem, like Washington Heights, like Inwood, as being a place where we can have community power, which is this picture above I took from the New York City government website, is a picture of a shared solar system where people can receive 10 to 15% or so on utility bill discounts by being a part of a community power system. And this is one of the, not full, but one of the many different steps that we're taking to help get renters more involved in renewable energy and benefit directly from renewable energy in a way that they aren't as able to do that if they don't own their homes. So we also see the ability to have green jobs and build out more jobs specifically for people in disadvantaged communities. So our example is that We Act has trained over 115, 120 or so people in solar installation, and most of them come from Northern Manhattan and the Bronx that did these trainings with us. And a group of them created a solar worker cooperative, and they are now able to install solar panels and run their own business and be profiting off of their business directly instead of being employed by someone else in what a lot of our work is considered to be a really unfair solar energy employment industry. Whereas the report nationwide found that only about 14% of the solar industry is Black and African American people. And so we are dealing with essentially a repeat of the way the fossil fuel industry is structured. And what we're hoping to see through investments in building up workers, building up cooperatives, doing more local solar job work will allow us to change that shift that system around a bit. I think that is my last example is climate justice in East Harlem. We work a lot in East Harlem, which is an area that has really high heat vulnerability and is a major flood zone and is an area of huge populations of low-income people of color and monolingual Spanish-speaking people. And we are really concerned about East Harlem because there's a new subway. A subway is getting expanded into East Harlem, which will making the area a much more accessible place inevitably leads to a lot of development and gentrification. And so what we're working on is how do we combat that by revitalizing the neighborhood for the people that are here, who have been in Harlem for decades, and instead of moving towards gentrification. And one really big piece of this is the climate resilience piece. The picture on the right you see is 125th Street. There's basically no trees on 125th Street. There's a couple little baby ones, and that's about it. It is a huge truck route, lots of traffic. And at the end of 125th Street, you have the waterfront that hasn't been repaired since Hurricane Sandy and is home to some of the densest, actually the densest area of NYCHA public housing development in all of New York City. And so you have a soup of issues here, and what we see a 35 to 40% investment minimum in East Harlem could be really building up the resiliency piece. So filling in the gaps of the waterfront plan that hasn't been finished yet for the city, creating greenway, a green space for people to spend time on 125th Street, getting buses off the street that are polluting, for example. So there's a lot of things that we can do in East Harlem, and that's all laid out in our community visioning plan that we did in 2018 and 2019. So that's it for me. Those are just some examples of where we see the importance of the disadvantaged communities criteria and why we're so involved in it, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Sonal. It was great to see all of those possible projects that could receive funding and should receive funding. How do you envision like the next step of all of this rolling out after, the plan is finalized at the end of this year? And Samir, I know you talked a little bit about the timeline, and so did Jen, but I wonder, like, how long do we think it will take to actually implement, using this criteria to get the funding moving towards some of these, great projects that you highlighted? Do you have any sense of that? And will you continue with the climate justice working group? Will that group continue to kind of advise like the state's spending in any way, or CLCPA implementation? I wonder what the next steps are for that group.
Yeah, so I'm sure Samir can talk through the official timeline here, but I'll say the criteria public comment period is until, I think Jen put it up on, is I think around March 2023. So after that, the criteria will be finalized. However, there is an interim criteria that the state does use and is being actively used to ensure that programs that are going to continue into 2023 and programs that are happening now are receiving specific considerations for disadvantaged communities. So I do see planning happening now around the fact that this mandate does exist. And in terms of these projects, I guess it all just depends on how quickly we can work through governmental funding processes and planning processes. But I do imagine it will be, each project will take time. Oh, and the Climate Justice Working Group does exist in perpetuity. I have no plans to leave the Climate Justice Working Group. Like Samir says, we will meet annually to revise the criteria as needed.
Yeah,
Great.
and I would also just like reiterate too that the working group under the law is to advise on the DEC's regulations, along with the Environmental Justice Advisory Group, on the regulations that the DEC will promulgate to implement, the main recommendations of the scoping plan.
So I saw that someone shared, Natalie Vena, op-ed in City Limits, which I haven't had a chance to read yet. I didn't see prior to this, but thank you for sharing that. And one of the issues that Natalie is elevating is about that this criteria apparently it ends up then including Manhattan, Hudson Yards, the High Line as disadvantaged, while many communities of color in Queens do not. So I wonder if anybody would like to speak to that. I'm sure there's a lot of thorny kind of issues that were hashed out in this process. And I know it took a ton of time and effort, to get to agreement on this draft criteria. But there's always controversy in these processes. And I just wonder if anybody can speak to some of those concerns. Samir or Sonal or Jen.
Well, I could just start and say thank you, Natalie, for raising those issues. And everyone, that is why we have a public comment period, because we need to get, there's always more information out there, and we can always make these things more perfect. And so once the public comment period is over, me and the DAC team will gather all the public comments. We'll give them for the Climate Justice Working Group to review. And so please, provide all of your points, your logic, and your reasoning as to why you think there should be modifications to that. And with 45 indicators and all of the different steps I mentioned, yeah, I mean, it is certainly possible that things weren't perfect, but that's again why we have the public comment period, to make sure that we get it as right as we can and continue to evaluate it.
Sonal or Jen, did you want to chime in on this one?
I mean, I think that those are I just kind of echo what Samira said, that those are really important points, and we do want to make sure we're capturing genuinely the most disadvantaged communities. That's the intention. And so submitting these, like literally pointing out where the census tracts are that are not included, that should be included, and then pointing out census tracts that are included that shouldn't be included is extremely helpful. And this is, the definition is iterative, like the way it's written into law is that we are coming back every year to change it, so if needed. And so this is always good to point out, and like Samir said, we'll be going back to the definition after the public comment period.
Yeah, I would just add that it's always going to be a challenge when you're doing, when you're taking a kind of a geographic community approach, because communities do change over time. And, you know, we saw even, you know, during COVID, you know, there was, you know, a lot of changes, people moving out of the city and into areas, and there has been some gentrification, and just in a short period of time, you know, communities are changing, but that it's still, it's still so important to look at communities as these holistic entities, and that's why it has to be a living document. And I've just been trying to encourage as many people as possible to look at it and look at the map and ground truth it from their own community perspective to see if it makes sense to them. So encourage you all to do that.
Yes, this is meant to just be kind of an intro to help get you started, or get us all started on the same page with this. And we have a little bit of time, thankfully, before the comments are due, you know, to look at all of this more closely. But let's, you know, try in our remaining 12 minutes to get through some more of these questions. From Stacy, I live in Amenia. We are designated as a DAC by the CJWG, but we're not on the NYSERDA map. How can we become recognized as a DAC by NYSERDA? And I think, you know, that's a great question, because it is, and then I'm sorry if you went over this, Samir, and I missed it myself, but it is a little confusing when you have the, you know, DEC environmental justice designation, right? And you have NYSERDA, and now you have this, and like, how is it all gonna kind of fit together? And, you know, how can we make sure that communities that should be designated are in the final, you know, the final plan?
Yeah, and I mentioned as in the chat, like the working group criteria, that is the only one that every state entity will use as it implements the Climate Act. I think all of the previous definitions, like environmental justice communities, and you know, whatever other state agencies use, I think those were all created obviously before the Climate Act is taking effect. But yeah, the working groups criteria will be the only one that we all use. So we're all on the same page, obviously.
Okay, so that's helpful. So I see some concerns from Stacy in Dover about not being able to get the EJ map from DEC Region 3 to review for the latest industrial energy project, but it sounds like, maybe not to say that doesn't matter, but that ultimately, like, this is the criteria that the state is going to be following for future designation and funding. And so really the one that we should be paying attention to. Did I get that right, Samir?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
And pollution.
Okay, so let's see. We had a question about from Matthew Baker Pool. Can someone comment on how the weight of factors was determined aside from targeting an equal weighing of environmental and climate risk versus socioeconomics, population characteristics, in parentheses? Also, can you comment on the relative weight of indicators if they were not equally weighted within each factor? So I guess a little more detail about how you all ended up kind of factoring in these different indicators and weighing their different degrees of importance.
Is Sonal still on?
Sonal?
Yes, I guess I can start. So, I mean, it started by basically like everyone from the Climate Justice Working Group, which everyone has a range of expertise. I mean, I myself was trained in public health. We were, joined by DEC members that are experts in air pollution. Everyone kind of has a huge range of expertise, all created a master list of a huge number of indicators that from the research and from these different points of expertise, we knew were factors in determining vulnerability to climate change. So we started with a list, I think it was around 200, it was like 150 or between 150 and 200 indicators. And then months and months and months of whittling down was kind of the process that we went through. Some of it was the data was incomplete, there wasn't enough data to use for a certain indicator, or like Samir was saying, some of them became duplicative, like there was no point in keeping two different air toxics that cause cancer because they were mapped to the exact same geographic space. So it would just have been hard on the computer system, or I don't even know how to say that, to calculate that map. It was better to just use one, for example. So there was a lot of different reasons why we kind of continued to whittle down, but then that's sort of how it ultimately came to around 40. And the weighing was determined, I mean, Samir can also jump in on this. The weighing was determined in part due to research that showed how important certain factors were in comparison to others, maybe, or the weighing came down to a need to emphasize climate risk because that's what this law is aiming to do, or, there was kind of different justifications for different determinations. I believe that there is a set of slides that is publicly available that does actually explain the significance of each of the indicators that were used. So I would recommend, if you're interested, looking at those slides. I think it's from the December 13th or December 9th Climate Justice Working Group meetings, and you can actually read why each one was picked. But it sort of just came up to a lot of reasons. And race was weighed, for example, being Black, Latinx, Indigenous was weighed heavier, for example, because the research has shown that is actually, frankly, the number one contributor to climate risk. So, it was really based on the understanding, both academic and from on the ground experience of what's important.
And I'll just add, income was double weighted to account for deep poverty.
Oh, it sounds like it was an incredible amount of work and a lot of, thoughtfulness that went into developing this criteria. But of course, we are in the public comment period. And so people should be free to, raise additional concerns. And with only 5 minutes left, I will hit on a couple of questions. One that I had related to proportional benefits. And if we got this right, that, if 35% of this, if more than 35% of the state, right, is DAC or is being considered that, then doesn't that mean that they would then get, less of the proportional benefits? If we're counting like 35% of the state geographically, plus all the LMI households, can you talk a little bit about that sort of proportionality issue?
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And I think the first thing I will say is that that's the floor of the benefits that that the state intends to deliver. I mean, that's the legal requirement, but just, we would like to aim for higher than even 40%. Now, this is why also the Climate Justice Working Group is going to evaluate this on an annual basis to make those necessary adjustments. And if the definition is too broad, then it can be, it can later be narrowed. I mean, there's a lot of different complex considerations to take into account, and you just certainly cited one of them.
Thanks, Samir. And yeah, I did say someone asking, is a census tract too large? So yeah, thank you for touching on that. And knowing that this is going to be an iterative process as we go forward is important to note. And what outreach did happen, with communities around this whole public comment period? Did the DEC and NYSERDA do much outreach and education? I know that we've kind of been clamoring for more on the Climate Act as a whole, that we really need to kind of step up our game as a state and make sure that more New Yorkers know that the Climate Act was passed, and all of the opportunities and changes that are going to be happening. But in particular, as it relates to this, what was the outreach that occurred, Samir?
So we did do 2 public education sessions a little bit before all of the hearings, and we've been engaging community groups and members and encouraging them to get involved in the process. I will say that I am also disappointed in the fact that we could do better. And so there's always more engagement and outreach to do to get more people involved. And we're going to keep overturning every stone that we possibly can to do that. So, but that's pretty much, yeah. I mean, that's what I can really say.
So I would just encourage people, and this is like one of my top comments in my public comments on the scoping plan, and will be in this public comment period as well, that a lot more, a far higher level of resources needs to be devoted to public education and outreach, generally by the state, but especially the hardest communities to reach are disadvantaged communities, and an extra effort has to be made to get information, and it's a two-way interaction. It's not just getting information to them, but also having constantly learning what the hurdles and barriers are. So if we're going to succeed in reaching our climate goals, that investment to me is critical. And the point that was made about resources, this is all happening in a very difficult context because we have such extreme inequality right now. There are a lot more people that need help in making this transition, but we just have to figure out how to fund that, because it's the only way we'll get there, and we'll be better off as a society if we do.
Well, I think that was a great place to end this. And it is 1 o'clock. There were some other really important questions that I wanted to get to, but I want to be respectful of our speakers' time and everybody's time. If you participated in this on your lunch hour, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our speakers for your time and energy and all of the hard work that went into developing this. We will be getting answers to the questions that weren't answered. Again, I apologize that we are running out of time, but thank you so much for contributing those and your thoughts and interest in this important topic. We're going to keep working to make sure that this clean energy transition is just and equitable, and we need everybody to participate to make sure that it is. So thank you all for being here. We'll send the recording and the questions with answers as soon as possible. So have a wonderful day, and let us know, if we can be helpful as you work on your comments to submit. Again, the due date is July 7th, so it's coming up. And I don't know if anybody had any last thing that they wanted to say or plug, but the floor is yours. Any of our speakers or anybody?
Just want to say thank you, and please everyone comment. Submit comments.
Okay. Yes, we will be commenting, and Samir, thanks for sharing your info, and we'll circle up with you to get some more information and answers to those questions. So thanks again, everybody. Look forward to seeing you all again, hopefully soon. We may do one really focused on equitable building decarbonization next. Who knows, maybe Sona will be back. We work closely together on that issue. Yeah, we'll keep building this movement. So thank you all so much. Be well, take care.
Thank you.